Let's make a formal introduction for our listeners. Good afternoon, Gregory. My name is Claudio, and I'm calling you from Washington, D.C., from the student Fairfax City. We're very humble and grateful that Gregory Spawton accepted our invitation to the show. Well, Gregory, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you for having me.
Gregory, let's go back to the beginning in your life. Were you born in a musical family? How old were you when you perhaps began taking piano lesson or guitar lesson? Back in the day.
So, a completely unmusical background. I literally played recorder at school, sang in the church choir, things like that. I started to get heavily into music when I was sort of 15, 16. I think I saw a couple of bands and I suddenly thought I want to play guitar. So I got a guitar when I was 17. It's the first time I'd ever picked up a guitar. So a very late starter. I took a year out before I went to university and sort of studied hard and learnt to play. Formed a band called Equus and we played some shows and things like that. And then I went to uni and I was trying to be an archaeologist and I kind of really didn't do much music. And I came back to it probably in the late 80s, so I took a little break. So I honestly, my background is not really musical at all. It's just something that came from listening and enjoying music rather than from something that's in the sort of family background.
And then, so you were like in bands equivalent of high school. I imagine that you were not just 100% music, but was any family pressure to go to university, forget about music? A musician is a crazy lifestyle. You're not going to make any money. Go to academia, get a job.
Quite the opposite, actually. I was a massive hippie, and so I had very long hair. Yeah. And my mum, bless her, my mum's still alive now, but she just assumed that I would just go and do my own thing and meet a girl and just play guitar. So there was no pressure from her whatsoever. She very much wanted me just to kind of do whatever made me happy, really. She did want me to go to university, but she wasn't, she didn't kick off about anything. My stepdad, I used to practice so many hours a day for a year or so that it did used to wind him up a bit, because of course we were living in a flat at the time and all you could hear was this guitar scales. So it must have been a bit mind blowing for him. Bless him. But no, there was no pressure at all. It was just, I had a tough childhood for a few years, but by the time I'd taken up guitar, things had settled down. And, my mum just said, go and do what you wanted to do. And broadly, that's what I did, bless her.
Yeah, good. What kind of music were you listening at the time when you were 18 to 20 years old? Were you in progressive rock?
Yeah, I was. I started, I in the early 70s, when I became aware of music, my parents would have music in the car. And so I was kind of, my mum would listen to Barbra Streisand, my stepdad would listen to Rod Stewart, and I'd hear sort of classic 70s kind of music, Harry Nilsson, things like that. So, the radio was good then. I had a good, these kind of things were in the background and they sort of seeped into my soul. Glenn Campbell, things like that. And I got into prog rock quite early. I think maybe. Oh no, I know what it was. It was my brother. My brother bought Sunny England by the Pound. Well, yeah. So my brother's 5 years older than me. He went record shopping. At the time in England, the Sex Pistols had started, and his friends were trying to get him to buy the Sex Pistols album, but he sort of didn't. He bought Sunny England by the Pound instead. He brought it home. He used to have these very long baths, and he'd leave the bathroom door open. And he'd put his record on and he'd turn it up really loud when my mum was out. And so the whole house would have this sort of be filled with Sunny England by the Pound. And so that was just kind of, this was kind of this noise in the background. And then after a bit of time, I began to really tune into it. And I can actually remember the moment I was at the bottom of the stairs and I heard this little guitar tune, da 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 da, and it stopped me in my tracks. I thought, that's really nice. And I asked my brother about it. And I remember him saying to me, these songs are really long. And that interested me because I wasn't used to the concept of ambitious rock music. It was sort of a backdrop of pop music. I mean, maybe some of the Beatles was complex and ambitious, but, generally pop music was 3 or 4 minutes. So that intrigued me. And I started listening to that album really, really heavily. And then, I started collecting Genesis albums. And you mentioned before we started the interview that you spoke to Armando Gallo, and that was a big thing for me. I bought his book on Genesis. There were not many rock biographies at the time. They're quite popular now, but back then there were not many. So I bought his book. I think it was The Evolution of a Rock Band. Then it was published as I Know What I Like. And I started reading that. And of course, it began to mention other progressive rock bands, Van der Graaf Generator being one of my favorites. And of course, there wasn't the internet then. So how did, in 1977, 78, 79, how did you find out about rock history? It wasn't easy. You'd pick up the stuff on the radio, you'd pick up what people said to you. You'd talk to your friends at school, but you didn't have a kind of this instant connection with the music that you're interested in and the wider world that was out there. So I kind of, that book was really important. I started to listen to other bands like Yes and etc. And I got heavily into prog rock. And then in the early 80s in England, in the UK, suddenly we had a second wave of progressive rock bands headed by Marillion, who were the only one that became really successful. But there were other bands like 12th Night and Solstice who I absolutely fell in love with. And we had a rock club here, a famous one called the Marquee in London. And I used to go down on the train. I was only 17 at the time, but again, my mum just used to let me. And so I'd just go on the train and I'd be back home at sort of 4 o'clock in the morning. But I'd go most weeks, to see these bands. And they were a small venue, but it was just hot and sweaty and exciting. It was rock music. It was prog rock. It was great. So that's kind of where I started. That was totally in my mind when I picked up a guitar and I wanted to do, that's what I wanted to do, that sort of thing. And weirdly, many, many years later, that's kind of ended up what I do.
Yeah. You mentioned Selling England by the Band. That was one of probably top 10 albums in the history of music, according to me. I mean, it's Genesis was way ahead of the time. And you mentioned the Marquee Club. That place it doesn't exist anymore. It was very, very famous. Everybody who is somebody in the music business kind of plays one way or another the Marquee Club because that was very, very famous. All the big names. Big name. They end up playing here.
Yeah, it was. And in fact, Genesis went back there and played a show, I think in 1980 or 81, just like a tiny show. And I remember the story is because they had 2 drum kits, of course, and they could hardly fit them on the stage. And I think Phil knocked half of his drum kit off halfway through. So they knew how important it was to them as well. And to the extent that they went back and played there. So it was my upbringing, really. It was some, I just got heavily embroiled in music, and it became, I think as a lot of prog rock fans are, it becomes, again, you said before we started the interview how important music's been to you in your life and still is. And I think that's the thing with prog rock. People that listen to prog rock, they feel it hard. It's a big part of their core identity. It's not just top 40 music in the background. It's really important to their core being, really. It's where they, it's emotional connections with other people. It's a lot of things. So I'm very, it's strange. I mean, I listen to lots of other things, but I'm sort of rooted in prog rock, and I'm not ashamed to admit it or anything else. I love it. It's a great genre. It's where rock music, tries to be something, something more. And at its very best, it's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. When I was living in South America, right, in the 80s, before I came to the United States to study, I was I will go to used record store, buy vinyl, and that was, of course, before the internet, no cell phone, nothing. And I will buy records of, I don't know, Genesis or Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd. And I said, man, I want to listen to this band. It sounds so great. Of course, at the time, the bands were not going to Latin America. We're kind of stopping in Brazil. Now everybody go there, and because it's money to be made. During the winter here in Europe and in the United States, and summer there, so many bands. So I was going crazy that I was buying all the record. Who are these people, man? They sound so good, So, and I was, I got lucky along the way, I suppose. You formed the band in 1990. Big Betrayal. What was the motivation? I mean, eventually you start playing with your friends and said, well, let's just try to put something together.
Yeah, I had a day job at the time, and I just left university, and I bumped into this guy at work on the very first day in the office, and he played guitar, and he said, "Oh, what do you play?" And I said, "Well, I also play guitar. And what sort of music do you like?" And that was this completely random thing that a guy that became a really close friend to me and became a big part of Big Train happened to be a huge prog rock fan. So we both had a completely shared sort of musical DNA, really. He was working with a friend of his called Ian Cooper, a childhood friend of his, and they were doing, they had a band called Arkshine, and they were doing just the two of them, just taping stuff in their rooms, did a couple of gigs and stuff, a bit more like Ultravox, that kind of synthy thing. And then Andy was kind of two-timing in with me, so he was doing me some evenings and Ian other evenings. And we had a 12-string guitar, and we were doing these big sort of rambling Anthony Phillips kind of things, these 10-minute guitar pieces that we put together. And eventually, I kept saying to Andy, look, Ian plays keyboards, why don't we just, make a band? Let's just get together. So eventually, after about a year, he introduced me to Ian, who I still know very well. And we formed Big Train, the three of us. And the name, it's a terrible name for a band, but then so a lot of names are terrible for bands, aren't they? It was the only one that we could we sort of mutually agreed on. We threw lots of names in the hat. We got a drummer, and we started gigging locally, and I was effectively what happened is nobody else could be bothered to write, so I ended up doing most of the writing, so it became kind of a vehicle for my songs. But the other guys were really important. Whilst I was delivering, I guess, the chord sequence and the melodies, they were, arranging it and putting their heart and soul into it. So we did what all little bands do. You play local gigs, you write music, you try and get, put a couple of demo tapes together, that sort of thing. Same old pattern that everybody else has. And eventually we got a little session on a local radio show, and that radio station paid for bands to go into a professional studio to record one song. And that was a big moment, because the guy running that studio was Rob Aubrey, who I still work with now. And we did a little song for this radio thing, met Rob Aubrey, and it became clear that Rob was able to perhaps help us to record an album at a 24-track studio, 2-inch tape, full pro sort of thing. So we went in there and recorded with some money I borrowed from my parents. We recorded an album called Goodbye to the Age of Steam. That was our first experience in a proper studio.
And then, so you end up recording an album. Were you able to sell that album and start playing in bigger clubs, or I suppose bigger coffee shop, or no, not really?
Not really. We felt a bit let down by we'd signed to a very small label called GEP, and they were it was the label for IQ, a prog rock band called IQ, who were around in the early 80s, still around now. And on sort of signing to them, there was a sort of suggestion that we'd get to support IQ, which would be our foothold into bigger audiences, but that never really happened. We got one show supporting them at the Astoria in London, which is quite a big venue, so that we had 25 minutes on stage in 1996. So that was our one big one bigger show moment, and then I think we had a festival in the Netherlands, so we drove all the way out to that, called Prog Farm, in maybe 97 or something. But it was all getting a bit, I'd got kids. Ian had left by then. People were having kids and life was getting in the way, so it was all getting a bit fractious and a little bit too much work, really. So, you kind of, like almost everybody, you just kind of have to make a decision whether or not you just quit or you just sort of keep it as a hobby. And I did the latter, really. Mainly because I didn't have other hobbies, I suppose. So I just carried on writing songs and working more or less with Andy at that stage. And we'd lost, our GP lost interest in us, and it was all a bit not great. So we did, again, we were watching what other people were doing, and other people were able to release their own albums on their own labels. Like Marillion started doing that, and other bands started doing that. So we thought, we'll do that then, shall we? But the one thing that we did that we got right at that time was, rather than keep going into expensive studios, we bought some recording software called Pro Tools. We bought some expensive microphones, and we started doing as much recording as we could in our home studios, because that meant that our recording costs were, next to nil once you paid for that capital outlay. So we put together three albums like that. Difference Machine, Gathering Speed before that one, and an album called Bard as well. So we had a sort of run of 3 albums that we did with a new singer, Sean Filkins, and that we did ourselves. And we found, rather strangely, that we began to pick up an audience. We went from selling, famously, Bard sold 300 copies, and still we carried on. And then the next album, Gathering Speed, started to sell a few thousand, and then Difference Machine a few thousand more. And then by the time we got to the Underful Yard in 2009, suddenly, with a new singer, David, it suddenly, we started to shift tens of thousands of albums. And we were like, wow, this is actually becoming, like a not just a hobby band anymore. It's becoming something that's more professional. And it was a strange, it was just one of those things. We just hung on in there. We got better at what we did. I got much better at writing over the years, and David was a very, very good singer. So he was able to lift our material and really show off what we could do. And also, two other important characters came into my life. One was Nick DiVirgilio, who we started using as a session player in 2007 on the Difference Machine. And I immediately, once you're sat in the studio working with this guy, you think, my God, this guy's an incredible drummer, like an extraordinary player. And that the whole band just lifts everything up several levels. And also I began working with a chap called Dave Desmond, who's a brass arranger, and he arranged brass for us on the Underful Yard album. So there was a kind of coming together of people that just began to push the band to a much, much higher level than I could ever have dreamed of, really.
Yeah, well, that's great. You mentioned the album from 2007, the Difference Machine. That's a masterpiece, man. With, of course, Nick DiVirgilio, and then Dave, and then Pete from Marillion. There are 2 albums, actually. If I take a lot of the history of big train. I don't have everything, but I have several albums for you, and then the Different Machine, and also the album called the Underfalling 2 years later.
Yeah.
A big difference, in my opinion, between the first, like you mentioned before, right? The 94 Goodbye to the Edge of the Steam, the 97 English Boy Wonder, Bar and Weather, but in 2007, the Different Machine was, in my opinion, my humble opinion, without being a musician, it was another level altogether. It was like a different band. I mean, this guy like graduated, from there in the big leagues or so, so to speak, right? So
I think it was, I think it is I still think it's a good album. It's quite we got into a band briefly called the Mars Volta, and we were influenced by them. So it's a little bit spacey at times and a little bit looser, I think. It's got a good vibe to it, that album. We worked really hard on making that. And the nice thing is the Wonderful Yard, which is completely different musically, is also strong, so we ended up with a couple of albums there that were really, in my opinion, nicely recorded, nicely made, and spoke of sort of two different sort of sides of the band, but both of them did well for us. They were Different sold a lot. Wonderful Yard sold a hell of a lot more. And I think if I look at it from the perspective of now, I think it's because of David's voice that the band began to reach a wider audience. So Sean Filkins, who was a really good singer, he had sort of more of a rock voice, but David had a sort of a soul voice. And I think at that time he brought a lot of soul and emotion into the music. And we're rehearsing a couple of songs. We're going to play a couple of songs from the Wonderful Yard in our tour in a few weeks' time. And it's nice going back and listening to them again and playing them again, because there's a lot of emotional content there, which I think, and that's the thing for me with music. I think with especially progressive rock, because it's sometimes quite complicated music, I think you mustn't forget the emotional heart of things. It's getting those things together that is where it really, really starts to make people, want to listen to you. And David's voice was a big part in the band, going further on and deciding to go and start playing live again. It was at that stage we were just a studio thing, really.
How did you end up meeting Dave? Because I think he was that close to getting the gig with Genesis at the time, with Peter, with Phil Collins, that ended up leaving, right? So he was that close, and they ended up picking up Calling All the Station, I think was the album.
Yeah, totally. And I didn't know anything about the story of Genesis's, who they were. I mean, I obviously knew they'd found Ray Wilson, but I didn't really know who else had been in the running. And when David basically came and sang a song or two songs for a chap called Martin Orford, who was the IQ keyboard player, and he was doing some solo recordings. And Rob, our engineer, rang me on the day that he did the session with David, and he just said, "This guy's just come in. He's just amazing. This is the guy that you need." And I wasn't looking for another singer at the time. I was perfectly happy with Sean, so I was a little bit wary about it. But Rob sent me some rough mixes of the songs. I thought, yeah, he's got a really good voice, this guy. So I mean, David lived a long way away from me, so I ended up giving him a call, and we spent several weeks getting to know each other just on the phone. It was a phone. We didn't have voice. We didn't have video things in those days. Right. So yeah, we just talked. And he, of course, being a big Genesis fan, I asked him about the audition process, and he was. In fact, what happened was they selected two singers. They selected David and Ray, and David got contracted. He was on holiday, and they flew a contract out to wherever he was, Tenerife or whatever. So he was signed as the singer for Genesis, and then the management got cold feet about there being two guys, and said, you need to make a choice here. So they went with Ray, and Ray understandably got more of a background success story because he'd had a hit single with, I think, Stiltskin. And David hadn't, he'd not, he'd always been under the radar. He'd done one solo album, but hadn't got much of a track record in professional music. So that was it. Yeah, I mean, David used to tell me these fabulous stories of his time with Genesis. He went and sang with them a couple of times at the studio. Of course, Nick DiVigilio was he recorded drums on the same album, the Calling Us Nations album. So they were sharing notes. Lots of stories I can't tell. Sadly, I can't in public. But some really interesting sort of background stuff, and some shared background musical DNA there. And it did sting. If I'm honest, it did sting David. If you imagine at the time it was a new beginning for Genesis. David had, struggled in his sort of solo career. Suddenly it looked like he was about to become, the singer for one of the most iconic progressive rock bands on the planet and play big shows and all those things. And then it was just taken away from him. It was there and then it was gone. So he quit music. It was a massive blow to him, and he quit music. He went off and had some kids and things like that. And it was only that he decided at some stage. I think that's the thing. If you're a musician, it's hard to resist the call. You're always going to be called back. And at some stage, he just thought, I can't not be a musician, singer, songwriter. That's what I've got to do. Which is why he called Martin Orford and said, "Can I sing a couple of songs for you?" And that's how he circuitously ended up in Big Big Train.
And then you guys, thank you very much. And you end up at the time, you guys were more like in a studio band. And then what was, I suppose, any pressure from the record label? Well, you're going to studio, we're selling record, but hey, we want to make more money. You need to go on the road. So put your stuff together and then let's start touring. Right? It was difficult.
Well, we were doing everything ourselves. It was a complete homespun, home-run operation. In fact, it became a nightmare as we started selling more and more albums. We did a couple of albums called English Electric. The whole house here would just be full of CDs. It was just, before streaming had really kicked in. So it was becoming difficult to manage. I still had a day job. My wife was helping me out massively. She still had a day job. So it was a huge operation for us. And I actually began to get to a stage where I was dreading doing albums because of the amount of admin. I'm not very good with admin, and it was something that all musicians are rubbish at admin, but it's something that I really struggle with, as my wife would tell you. So we just sort of battled through that. But at some stage, we started making a forum on Facebook and stuff like that, and you began to have much more direct contact with the fans. And I began to realize that there was an expectation that, you're a band, you need to be performing. Yeah. And I have to be honest, I'm a bit of a nervy performer. I'm not particularly, I've never been wanting to be on stage in front of people. I'm more of a songwriter. But I could see in 2013, actually, we need to do this. We need to get back on stage. David was very reluctant. He was at the time, his partner at the time was not supportive and did not want her husband or partner to be, wasting time in going back to music, I suppose. So it was hard to persuade him, but in the end he committed, and we booked a couple of shows at a venue in London called King's Place. And that was we had a year to prepare for it. We booked the shows, again, totally self-promoted. I didn't know what tour management was or anything like that. And, me and my wife, Kathy, did the vast majority of all the organisation. It's a massive amount of work. And, I started to just think, Christ, I'm going to be back on stage soon. And in the intervening years, I'd gone from being the guitar player to the bass player. And so I spent a few months learning my parts and all that sort of stuff, and found myself on stage, at this small but sold out venue in London. And that was the start of another chain of events that, led to the band selling more albums and doing more shows and all of those things. It was amazing. Honestly, the first night we walked out, because I think there was a sort of disbelief that we would do it, and we did it with a brass band and everything. It was a full lineup, and it was just 400 people there. But that was, of course, the hardcore fan base that were there the first weekend, and it was just like this wall of noise, and it was amazing. Honestly, I still look back at it and it makes the hairs rise on the back of my neck. And of course, you then think, "Wow, I really like this. We must start playing some more shows." And so we have over the years, albeit we never played that many. This autumn, we're doing 17 dates, I think. So that's the longest tour we've done so far, and I think our future will be doing a lot more gigging. Hopefully, but we'll see.
Yep. That's great. In around 93 to I think 98, if I remember correctly, you were signed to Giant Electric P at the time, and I suppose, right, that they were doing, I suppose they were doing more of the admin stuff, booking venues, distributing the record, or you still were going to the post office every week to...
It was a license. It was a licensing deal, really. So, effectively, we would pay for the music to be recorded, and then we'd provide the album with them, and they would have it pressed up and sell it. But it was a very typical licensing deal. So, if you think of those days, maybe an album would sell for about £10, 10 British pounds, maybe $15 sort of thing. The label we'd get £1, 10% of the price for that. So you have to sell a lot of units to make it financially viable, and we didn't, and it wasn't really viable for them, and it wasn't viable for us. So they lost interest in us, and we, as I said earlier, we went off and did it ourselves, and it was the best thing for us because I learned personally a hell of a lot about the music business doing it ourselves. And probably also realized the limitations of doing it ourselves, how impossible it is really to, at a certain level, to try to do both things. But it was just, I think it's important, up until about 3 years ago, we were self-managing, so we did everything, we managed the band ourselves as well. So I got a good route I've got roots into many aspects of the business, which helped me, make informed decisions with our management now. So it's I wouldn't do any of that differently. It's just was ridiculously hard work for a while.
And I've been told by the fellow musician that you reach to a point where we are getting bigger. We have a bigger audience base. We want to play in different other venues. We trust, or we don't trust the record label. They're not doing that much for us. And they're taking, 90% of the profit. And you say, well, we should do it ourselves. And then the band kind of become 10% music and 90% managerial stuff, which for some people, they don't want to touch it, right? Like you say before, we are musicians, somebody need to book the venue. I don't want to call anybody, I want to record stuff. I want to play with my guitar, my bass, and, and how you balance that stuff. I mean, if you spend too much money in music, in management, you don't record the music, right? But then again, if you let a tour manager or a manager do everything for you, then you have less control. You may need to agree stuff that you don't want to, right? So,
you put your finger on it perfectly. I mean, you've got that, that contrast between the self-managing artist and, the artist signed to a label. Now, we have been talking over the years to a number of labels in recent years, and I can't announce anything at the moment, but it may be that we are going to do something different very soon. And, that's because we've reached a point, I think, where, it just, the trade-off is such that being with a proper record label, is just too much the right thing to do than trying to run things yourself, or with, even with management. So that's kind of where we are now. And there'll be news on that soon, and that will be a very big difference for the band, because it's like being back in the 70s when you had a label that is responsible for you, but you are responsible too, so suddenly we won't have control over when we release albums or how many albums we release, or that becomes something that is decided by other people. But there is a point reached, I think, and we've reached that point where you can only go so far doing things, for yourself, and you need the industry behind you to really get to that level where where you can get heard by as many people as possible. And that's it for me, and that's it for all of us in the band. It's purely about our music being heard by as many people as it could possibly reach. And so that's why we're looking at a different way forward right now.
Got it. Perfect. At the time, you end up releasing 3 great albums: English Electric Part 1, Part 2, and then Folklore. It's masterpieces, to me. And feel free to elaborate on that, how the English and then the second part came together. And
yeah, I'm very proud of those albums. They, David, it's the same with Alberto and new singer. I brought David in as a singer, and I didn't realize he was a really good songwriter as well. And the same thing's happened with Alberto. I brought him in as a singer, but he's a really gifted songwriter. So I've been in that respect. I've been very lucky with the people that I've worked with, because I think if it's just my songs, I think it's one person's take on music and one person's view on the world, and I think there's strength in diversity in that respect. So yeah, English Electric was a real high point for me, where David was writing some great material, I was writing some strong material, and we carried that through to Folklore as well. We got a sound that was right for us. We had this Dave Desmond brass band on board. We started to use string quartets. It was like it was like being in the Beatles. You suddenly had a bit of money to play with, so you could start to think, oh, I want a string quartet on this, let's bring in the brass on this one, and we can afford to record them. They were really good times, and we were able to put together a few albums, a good run of albums, I think, which took us, it reputationally took us further forward. And then, of course, we were also playing some good live shows by then as well. So I think generally things were on the up, and yeah, good times.
And then by the time you end up receiving several awards by the Progressive magazine, the Stone and Steel, Blu-ray, and then a Breakthrough Award at the Progressive Music Award as well. So, it's I suppose for a musician and for any profession, it's great to, hey, I worked so hard 20 years, and now I've been recognized. Yeah, we know we're selling records, and we go to we book a gig and people attend it, but big name magazine or institution telling you, hey, you guys are doing great.
That feedback's brilliant, and those Progressive Music Awards were really important. There's a magazine here called Prog Magazine, which has been it's been published since 2009, so it's been an ongoing concern for a long time. And it's really, it's done wonders in terms of, helping the identity of prog rock stay in the sort of public eye. And for a few years, they were doing these Progressive Music Awards, and they were brilliant because small bands like us would be there, but also Genesis would be there, or Van der Graaf would be there, right. Camel, all the big names would be there. And suddenly you were in this room together with these people, and it was a real, it showed how together the scene was, and how everybody recognized that prog rock is a particular identity, where people have these sort of shared musical values, I suppose. And I remember I was quite shy when I started going to those, and David, who was far less shy, I'd be going like, "Oh, there's Peter Hammer over there, one of my heroes," and so David would shove me towards him to say hi and all those things. But that was it. You'd go to the loo and find yourself standing next to Steve Rothery or something. It was really great nights. It's a shame they're not doing them anymore. But it's just, as I say, it's quite humbling when you realize that, even the biggest stars in prog rock are just as excited for you almost as you are. We've had Tony Banks has come to our shows, Anthony Phillips has come to our shows. It's lovely that there's that support from the old guard who can see that they've heavily influenced us. And we're almost carrying the torch for the music that they wrote back in the 70s, I suppose. Great times.
Yeah, good for you. And then, have you ever, by that you look back at, your first, one of the first albums that you listened was Clare Lindley by the band, the Genesis, and eventually to the year you were doing, there was customary for you guys to do rehearsal at the Real World Studios. Yeah. Peter Gabriel. So if for a kid that you listened to Clare Lindley by the one, you were 17, 18 years old, and eventually, man, we are doing rehearsal with one of the big name in the music history, so it's...
Yeah, I mean, Real World is an amazing place. There are not many residential studios left in the UK, probably not in the world, actually. So it is literally exactly as Peter Gabriel set it up to do. You go away as a bunch of musicians and you live on site. Yeah. You get out of bed in the morning, you have breakfast, and then you're just straight into the studio. These two amazing studios they've got there. It became a home from home for us for quite some time. Peter was elusive. We met him actually the last time we worked there before David died. We met him. We became aware that he was on site, and bless him, he came to. He just came into the canteen one day with his dog and said hi, and I'm going to speak to Peter Gabriel. So I ran. David was David. I think actually we were doing David's solo album at the time. So I ran and got David, and we just sat and chatted for a few minutes. It was a genuinely lovely moment, and he is a absolutely beautiful human being. And he, after David died, he took his time to sort of personally email us and message us and shared some kind words. He's been an extraordinary influence, and again, it's truly a privilege to meet these people and realize what lovely human beings they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked before that before we started recording that the two of us were on the same I went to the Verona gig and then I went to Milan as well. So we're talking about Peter Gabriel's tour, and the Verona gig is so beautiful, man. I mean, of course, just but the venue itself and
I'm a huge history nut. So when he announced the tour, I was like, oh my God, he's playing a Roman amphitheatre in Verona. Yeah, I'd visited the amphitheatre before just as a tourist to see the Roman ruins. But it was an irresistible thing, so we managed to get tickets. By chance, Big Train were recording the following week in Trieste, which is so probably a couple 100 miles from there, but close enough. So I actually I was supposed to arrive in Trieste on the Saturday, so I had to confess to our manager that I had actually bought a Peter Gabriel ticket on the Saturday night, and sorry, I'm going to be a little bit late. But they're really cool about it. And what an evening. And I think we all frightened it was going to rain for the whole gig, but it just sort of stopped almost 5 minutes after the gig started. It was an amazing show. And what a night that was.
Absolutely. You were at the time, I think we are talking about 2019, 2020, you guys getting bigger, and you thought, man, we need to do like a global scale touring. We know what we're doing. We're playing bigger venues. We need to kind of take our music out of the UK and more countries in Europe, and then go to the United States, and then the pandemic hit, and everything were shut down. How difficult it was for you guys?
It was a complete disaster. We were planning. We got to the stage of planning a US tour, and we'd paid for visas.